Hey guys, tonight we begin with the harsh, exhausting, and not so glamorous life of the samurai in medieval Japan. Those armored warriors with their curved blades and poetic codes of honor, whose images still fill movies and manga today. But while modern stories make the samurai look noble and cool, the truth is being a samurai actually sucked. And it was far from a life anyone should envy. So before you settle in, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you truly enjoy what I do here. And please let me know in the comments where you are watching from and what time it is for you. It is always fascinating to see how far this little channel reaches. Now, dim the lights, maybe make some tea or light a candle, and let us begin tonight's quiet journey together. Let us be clear, no boy in feudal Japan sat under a cherry tree and thought, you know what? I want to live in constant fear of death, follow a rigid code, serve a lord who might kill me on a whim, and end up forced to commit a final act of loyalty if I mess up. Becoming a samurai was not a personal dream. It was a role you were usually born into or thrust into through circumstances. You did not choose it. It chose you. And once it did, you were stuck. The image of the samurai as a wise, calm warrior who balanced swordplay with poetry is largely myth. The actual life of a samurai was much grimmer. You were a professional killer, bound to a master, and trapped in a strict social system that left little room for personal happiness. If you were lucky, your daimyo, or lord, valued your service and treated you well. If not, your life could be short, brutal, and controlled by someone who saw you as little more than a disposable pawn. And it was not like you could just quit. Samurai were expected to live and die by the code of Bushido, the way of the warrior. This was a rigid set of ideals that glorified loyalty, honor, and sacrifice. If you failed your lord, even by accident, the expectation was clear. You would perform a tragic end, a final act of loyalty, by following a painful but honorable tradition to preserve your honor. Yes, that was considered the honorable way out. This was not optional. You could be ordered to do it, and refusal would shame your family and erase your legacy. Imagine waking up every day knowing that one mistake, one political shift, or one bad mood from your master could lead to such a fate. It made every act of daily life a quiet walk on the edge of a sword. And let us not romanticize the combat itself. Samurai battles were terrifying and chaotic. Armor was heavy, cumbersome, and hot. The famous katana was a beautiful weapon, but real combat involved far more than elegant duels. On the battlefield, samurai fought fiercely in chaotic combat. Arrows flew, spears thrust, and the battlefield was chaotic. There was no honor in getting a fatal injury from an unseen strike while trying to prove your loyalty. Even off the battlefield, life was full of danger. Political intrigue, shifting alliances, and betrayals were constant. Samurai often lived in a state of paranoia. One day, you were favored. The next, you were expected to meet a tragic end for the convenience of your lord. And speaking of lords, many of them were not noble paragons of virtue. They were ruthless, ambitious men who saw their retainers as tools for power. Your loyalty was expected, but theirs was not guaranteed. And then there was the hierarchy. Not all samurai were elite warriors commanding armies. Many were low-ranking, barely above common peasants, scraping by on small stipends. You could spend your life training, serving, and fighting, only to end up poor, forgotten, and expendable. For these samurai, the reality was endless hardship with little reward. Family life was no refuge either. A samurai's duty came before personal happiness. Marriages were arranged for alliances, not love. Your children were expected to follow in your footsteps, continuing the cycle of duty and sacrifice. And heaven help you if your family became politically inconvenient. Entire families were sometimes expected to follow the tradition of an honorable end, or were slaughtered to eliminate potential threats. The stress of this existence was immense. Mental health, as we understand it today, was not considered. You were expected to endure silently. Any sign of weakness was shameful. Imagine the weight of carrying generations of honor on your shoulders, with no room to stumble or express fear. And for all this loyalty and sacrifice, the rewards were fleeting. Even the most skilled and honorable samurai could fall out of favor. History is filled with tales of great warriors discarded by their lords when they were no longer useful, and when the Tokugawa shogunate brought relative peace. Many samurai found themselves unemployed. Some became ronin, masterless samurai, wandering the land in disgrace, often forced into difficult choices to survive, or poverty to survive. So, while the samurai may look noble in paintings and films, the real life was far more tragic. It was a path of duty without freedom, danger without glory, and honor that could turn to horror with a single command. It is a life few would envy if they truly understood it. Let us break down one of the biggest myths first. The samurai were not all master swordsmen trained by wise old masters in secret dojos under cherry blossoms. There was no magical, flawless training that made every samurai a one-slice, unstoppable warrior. Real training was long, exhausting, and often brutal. And many samurai never became great fighters. They became good enough to serve and survive. That was all. A young samurai started training as a child. They learned archery first, because bows were more important than swords in many battles. They practiced riding horses, reading, writing poetry, and memorizing the Bushido code. Swordsmanship came later, and even then, training was rough and unglamorous. There were no glowing katanas or elegant duels, just endless drills, heavy wooden swords, and bruises. Training was about discipline, not flair. You practiced until your body could move without thought, and most of what you practiced was how to kill quickly and efficiently, not beautifully. The katana was revered, yes, but it was not magic. It chipped, bent, and broke like any blade. Real sword fights were fast, desperate, and ugly. And not every samurai could afford the best blades or armor. Wealth mattered. Rich samurai had fine weapons and custom armor. Poorer ones made do with whatever they could get. Some even fought in patched-together armor or borrowed gear. In battle, this made a huge difference. The ideal of the perfectly armed samurai was not the reality for most. And then, there was the battlefield itself. It was nothing like the one-on-one duels shown in films. Samurai fought in groups, alongside a shigaru, the common foot soldiers. You were often part of a larger formation, obeying orders, not charging alone in heroic style. You fired arrows, pushed forward with spears, and only drew your sword if forced into close combat. Close combat was terrifying. Your vision was limited by your helmet. The sounds were deafening. Blood, mud, and bodies were everywhere. You swung and stabbed while trying not to trip or be impaled. Survival depended as much on luck and stamina as on skill. Many skilled warriors died because someone shot them from behind or stabbed them in the leg, and the psychological toll was immense. You killed not just enemies, but sometimes peasants, prisoners, or even your own comrades if ordered. You suppressed uprisings, enforced harsh discipline, and enforced harsh rule. These were not acts of noble poetry. They were acts of cold obedience. And when the battle ended, there was no glory. There was looting, cleaning blood off armor, and waiting to see if your lord would reward or punish you, and if you thought peace brought relief. Think again. Times of peace could be even worse. Many samurai became bureaucrats, forced into dull roles guarding gates, overseeing taxes, or enforcing law. They still trained, but their sword was mostly symbolic. Yet they were bound to strict codes of behavior and still lived under constant pressure to maintain perfect honor. One mistake in public could mean forced a tragic end. An insult to a higher-ranking samurai could end in a duel you could not refuse, even if you were outmatched. Drinking too much, gambling, or even showing too much emotion could bring shame to your family. You lived your life as if always on stage, wearing the mask of the perfect warrior, even when you were exhausted or miserable. Marriage did not bring much comfort. Samurai wives also lived under strict codes. They were expected to manage the household, bear sons, and maintain the family honor. Their lives were full of duty and sacrifice, just like their husbands. Love was secondary to obligation. If the family honor was threatened, they too could be expected to follow the tradition of an honorable end alongside their husbands. Children faced the same harsh world. Boys trained from an early age, learning that failure could lead to disgrace. Girls were taught to be proper samurai wives. Everyone in the family carried the weight of the ancestors' honor. It was a crushing burden. And in this world, failure was not always your fault. A single political misstep, a rival's scheme, or your lord's fall from power could doom you. Entire families were compelled to meet a tragic fate for reasons they did not even understand. You might be loyal and capable, and still find yourself kneeling on a mat with a dagger in your hand, expected to meet a tragic end because someone else lost favor. So even in peace, the life of a samurai was a prison. You were trapped in duty, forced to play a role that left little space for joy or personal freedom. You obeyed, you served, and you hoped that fate would not turn against you. But more often than not, it did. Now, let us talk about the code itself, Bushido, the way of the warrior. It sounds beautiful, almost poetic. Loyalty, honor, courage, compassion, respect. But in reality, it was a trap, a set of ideals so rigid that living under them was like walking through a field of hidden blades. Every choice you made could lead to disaster. Bushido was not written in stone. It evolved over time and varied by region and clan. But by the Edo period, it had become a strict moral cage. It told you how to live, and more importantly, how to die. And if you failed to meet its standards, your only honorable option was to face a tragic end. This was not strength. It was suffocating. Loyalty was the first demand. You were expected to serve your lord with complete devotion, not because he deserved it, but because that was your role. If your lord made foolish decisions, if he treated you badly, if he fell out of power, it did not matter. You followed him into ruin if needed, and if he died, you were expected to avenge him, or die trying. Honor was next. You had to guard your reputation at all costs. A single public failure could stain your family for generations. A poorly chosen word, a bad duel, even an accidental breach of etiquette could force you to end your life to erase the shame. And this pressure was constant. You lived every day knowing one misstep could doom you, and those you loved. Courage was required, but not just on the battlefield. You were expected to show no fear in any situation, even in the face of death. This meant masking your emotions at all times. You could not cry, hesitate, or show weakness. Imagine the strain of living like that, pretending to be unshakable even when terrified or grieving. Compassion was part of the code, but it was limited. You were expected to show mercy to the weak when it did not conflict with loyalty or honor, but in practice, this often meant nothing. Orders came first. If told to burn a village or execute prisoners, you obeyed, no matter what your heart said. To disobey would bring shame and death. Respect was also demanded, but again, it was a trap. You showed respect to superiors without question, even if they were corrupt or cruel. And you had to be endlessly polite, even when facing an enemy. A slip of the tongue could spark a duel or ruin your standing, so every conversation became a careful dance. And through all this, the threat of a tragic end loomed. A final act of loyalty was not rare. It was a common tool for maintaining the social order. Lords used it to remove inconvenient samurai. Clans used it to preserve family honor. And sometimes, samurai chose it themselves when trapped by impossible expectations. It was a horrible death, slow and agonizing, yet seen as the proper end for a true warrior. Imagine knowing that your life could end this way at any moment. That if your lord failed, or if you offended the wrong person, you would be expected to kneel on a mat, write a final poem, and open your own belly, and your family would be there to witness it, bound by the same code. It was not noble. It was terrifying. And Bushido also isolated you. You could not form deep friendships easily. Trust was dangerous. Rival samurai might smile at you one day and plot your downfall the next. Politics in the samurai world were ruthless. Clans rose and fell overnight. Alliances shifted like sand. You could be a loyal retainer today and an enemy tomorrow. Even your fellow samurai could be your undoing. Ambition was everywhere. If you stood out too much, someone might arrange your disgrace. If you were too loyal, you might be used and discarded. And if you tried to rise without the right backing, you would be crushed. the code demanded loyalty, but the world rewarded cunning. And in this world, the common people were not your allies. Samurai were above peasants, artisans, and merchants in the social order. But this brought no comfort. You were expected to act superior at all times. You could not mingle with commoners. You could not marry beneath your rank. You could not even show too much kindness, lest it be seen as weakness, and the people often resented you. Samurai collected taxes, enforced harsh laws, and punished dissent. Many peasants saw them as arrogant bullies, not noble protectors. Walking through a village, you might be greeted with bows, but behind those bows were cold stares and quiet hatred. And if times grew hard, that hatred could turn dangerous. So the life of a samurai was one of isolation. You could not trust your peers. You could not befriend the commoners. You could not show weakness to your family. And you could not escape the expectations of Bushido. Every day was a test, every action a gamble, and the price of failure was always death. Let us now look at the world beyond the code. Daily life for a samurai was not a series of heroic battles. It was mostly long periods of waiting, maintaining appearances, and dealing with endless duties. And none of this was glamorous. In fact, much of it was dull, exhausting, and quietly miserable. If you were not at war, and most samurai spent far more time in peace than in battle, your days were filled with ritual and routine. You rose early, performed prescribed morning rites, dressed in formal clothing, and attended to your lord's business. This could mean hours of sitting in silence, listening to court discussions where your opinion mattered little. You were there to be loyal, not outspoken. Physical training was a constant part of life, of course. You practiced archery, swordsmanship, and riding regularly, but as peace endured, many samurai found themselves spending more time perfecting etiquette and poetry than sharpening blades. And this created its own kind of strain. You had to master both the arts of war and the arts of refinement. Failure in either could damage your standing, and the pressure to appear perfect was relentless. You were expected to speak with measured tone, walk with controlled grace, and display unshakable composure at all times. Anger, sadness, or joy had to be carefully masked. The slightest outburst could lead to gossip, loss of reputation, or worse. Living like this, always performing, was exhausting in ways battle never was. Money was another constant source of stress. Despite their high social rank, many samurai struggled financially. The cost of maintaining proper clothing, weapons, and household servants was high. Yet stipends were often small and could be reduced at any time. Some samurai fell deeply into debt, forced to borrow from merchants they were supposed to disdain. This led to a bitter irony. Samurai looked down on merchants, seeing them as beneath them in status, yet many became financially dependent on the very people they despised. And this dependency came with humiliation. Merchants held the purse strings, while samurai clung to outdated notions of superiority. The tension was palpable, and there was little relief at home. Samurai households were governed by the same rigid expectations as public life. Wives managed every detail of the household, but were expected to show total obedience to their husbands. Children were raised with the weight of family honor, pressing down on them from the moment they could walk. Love was often a secondary concern. Duty came first, Imagine a household where every word was measured, every glance calculated, and every failure magnified. That was daily life for a samurai family. And behind the formal language and polite smiles lay a constant undercurrent of fear. A single scandal, a single false accusation could ruin the entire family. And as peace continued under the Tokugawa shogunate, things grew even worse for many samurai. With fewer wars to fight, many found themselves adrift. Their skills were less needed. Their stipends were cut. Some became ronin, wandering masterless samurai with no income or purpose. To be a ronin was a deep disgrace. You were viewed with suspicion and contempt. Many ronin turned to crime or menial work just to survive. And even those who retained their positions faced growing dissatisfaction. The ideals of Bushido remained unchanged, but the world had moved on. Samurai were forced into roles as administrators, guards, or ceremonial figures. Their swords became symbols, not tools. The dissonance between their training and their reality grew sharper. Imagine spending your life mastering the art of war, only to end up inspecting rice shipments or standing motionless at a gate for hours. It was soul-crushing. And yet, you were expected to do it with perfect grace and gratitude. To show frustration was shameful. To seek another life was unthinkable. You were trapped. And the longer peace endured, the more this trap tightened. Samurai became relics of a past age, bound by a code that no longer fit the world around them. Younger generations chafed under the weight of outdated expectations, but the path forward was blocked. The only escape remained the same as always: death. So the daily life of a samurai was a quiet, suffocating struggle. You lived under constant scrutiny. You maintained appearances at great personal cost. You fought against debt, dissatisfaction, and irrelevance. And through it all, the threat of disgrace and forced suicide loomed like a shadow. And when times grew turbulent again, things only got worse. The skills of war, long dulled by ceremonial life, had to be sharpened once more. But not all samurai were prepared, and in those moments, the cracks in the warrior ideal were laid bare for all to see. Let us now talk about the weapons and armor. The tools of the samurai were not magical. They were functional, often beautiful, but in practice, they brought more burden than glory. And understanding them gives us an even clearer picture of why the life of a samurai was so difficult. The katana, of course, is the most famous weapon. It was revered, crafted with great care, and passed down through generations. But the myth of the perfect blade slicing through anything is just that, a myth. Katanas were excellent cutting weapons, but they were fragile compared to modern steel. In battle, they chipped, bent, and broke. They required constant maintenance. A samurai who failed to care for his blade was considered disgraceful, and drawing the katana was not always practical. On horseback or in tight formations, it was often the wrong tool. Samurai used a variety of weapons. The yumi, the longbow, was primary in many battles. Skilled archers could rain arrows on enemies from a distance, and early samurai were as much horse archers as they were swordsmen. Spears, or yari, were also crucial. In many battles, the spear was far more important than the sword. It had greater reach, and was more effective in group combat. Samurai trained extensively with the spear, yet popular images rarely show this. The lone swordsman makes for better stories, but in truth, much of the fighting was done with simpler, more brutal tools. And then there was the armor. Samurai armor, or yoroi, was a work of art. Lacquered plates of iron and leather, laced with silk cords, adorned with clan symbols. It looked magnificent, but it was heavy, cumbersome, and hot. Moving quickly or silently in full armor was difficult, and on a humid day, it was a suffocating prison. Maintenance was endless. Armor had to be cleaned, cords replaced, plates checked for damage. And if you could not afford the best, your armor might be old, patched, or poorly fitted. In battle, this mattered. Ill-fitting armor slowed you down and could cost your life. And as firearms entered the battlefield, traditional armor became less useful. Muskets, or tanagashima, could pierce even the finest yoroi. Samurai adapted, but many viewed firearms with disdain. The code of Bushido prized personal skill. Killing from a distance with a musket seemed dishonorable. But war does not care about honor. The introduction of firearms exposed a deep flaw in the samurai ideal. Valor and skill mattered less than firepower and numbers. And this shift further eroded the samurai's place in the world. Many clung to outdated methods, unable to accept the new reality. Others embraced change, but faced scorn from their peers. And weapons training itself was grueling. Samurai spent years perfecting techniques that might never be used: sword forms, archery drills, mounted combat, all practiced endlessly. And in a time of peace, this became even more frustrating. You trained for war that might never come, while your daily duties grew more bureaucratic and dull. And even when war did return, not all samurai were ready. Generations raised in peace found themselves on the battlefield again, their skills untested. Some rose to the occasion, others faltered, and in those moments, the harsh truth of the warrior ideal was revealed. No amount of poetry or perfect posture could save you from a musket ball or a peasant with a spear. And let us not forget the mental burden of carrying these weapons. You wore your swords at all times, a constant reminder of your role. They marked you as samurai, but also isolated you. You could not relax in public. You could not show weakness, and drawing your sword in the wrong situation could lead to disgrace or death. So even the tools of the samurai, so revered in legend, added to the weight of the life. They were symbols of a role that demanded perfection, trapped you in endless ritual, and could betray you in a moment of need. Beautiful, yes, but also a constant reminder of how hard it was to truly live as a samurai. And as the world around the samurai changed, these burdens only grew heavier. The weapons remained the same, but the nature of warfare and society did not. And many samurai found themselves trapped between a past that glorified them and a present that no longer needed them. Now, let us look at what happened when you failed. Because in the life of a samurai, failure was never a small thing. It was a disaster. And the ways it could happen were many, some beyond your control. But the consequences were always the same: shame, ruin, and often death. Failure did not always mean defeat in battle. It could be a social slip, a financial problem, or a political misstep. Forgetting a ritual, offending a superior, losing control of your temper, all these could bring disgrace. And once disgrace touched you, it was nearly impossible to erase, and your family suffered along with you. Honor was a collective thing. If you failed, your wife, children, and even distant relatives carried the stain. Marriages could be broken, children denied opportunities, family members forced to distance themselves from you to protect their own standing. And in many cases, failure meant one path, a tragic end, a final act of loyalty. It was considered the honorable way to atone. You prepared carefully, wrote a death poem, dressed in white, took your place before witnesses, and then, with a short blade, you fulfilled the required final act. Trusted companions would ensure the act was completed according to tradition, but even so, it was a painful conclusion to one's duty. And it was public, designed to show your courage and acceptance of your fate. There was no hiding from it, and no way out if it was ordered, and even choosing to refuse a tragic end had no safety. If you fled or resisted, your family could be punished, lands seized, relatives compelled to meet a tragic fate in your place. So in the end, most complied, even if they dreaded it. It was not courage alone that drove them. It was the iron grip of the code and the threat to those they loved. And failure could come in ways you could not prevent. If your lord fell from power, you could be expected to meet a tragic end through no fault of your own. If a new regime viewed your family as a threat, the same result followed. You could serve loyally for decades, only to be erased in an instant. Political winds shifted constantly, and samurai were tools of their lords. If you were useful, you survived. If not, you were discarded, and loyalty offered no shield. In fact, it sometimes marked you for death, because new rulers feared those most loyal to their enemies. And public failure brought another horror: loss of face. The shame was public. You could be paraded in disgrace, your home defaced, your name stripped from records. In a society built on reputation, this was a fate worse than death, and many chose to die before it happened. And surviving failure was no victory. If you were spared a tragic end, your life was hollow. You lived as an outcast, stripped of rank and respect. No samurai would associate with you. Merchants and peasants avoided you, and your own family might disown you to save themselves. And this happened often. Samurai who made a wrong choice, or fell on the wrong side of a political struggle, found themselves alone and hunted. Some fled, living as ronin, but life as a ronin was brutal. You were seen as dangerous and untrustworthy. Many became mercenaries or criminals, simply to survive, and ronin faced their own deadly choices. Authorities hunted them. Other samurai looked down on them, and if they tried to return to society, they were often compelled to meet a tragic fate to cleanse their shame. So for many, life on the run ended in poverty, violence, or execution. And the worst part was this: no one mourned a failed samurai. Your death might be marked by a brief notice, but your name would be whispered with contempt. Families erased your memory to protect their future. Friends distanced themselves, and the world moved on. So the fear of failure hung over every moment of a samurai's life. It shaped every choice. It drove endless caution and sacrifice, and it made true peace of mind impossible. You lived under a sword that never stopped hanging, knowing that one misstep could end everything. And as peace continued and politics grew more complex, the traps multiplied. The chance of navigating life without some form of failure grew smaller, and many samurai found themselves walking a path they knew would end in ruin, with no way to turn aside. Let us now turn to the question of reputation, because for a samurai, reputation was everything. It shaped your future, your family's future, and even how your death would be remembered. But this made life even harder. Reputation was fragile, and maintaining it was a never-ending struggle. Your reputation began with your birth. If you were born into a respected clan, you carried the weight of its history. Every ancestor's deeds were part of your story, and this brought both pride and immense pressure. You were expected to add to that legacy, not tarnish it. Every action you took reflected on generations past. And if you were born into a lesser family, the pressure was different. You had to fight for recognition, to prove your worth. But the risks were higher. A single failure could doom not just you, but your descendants. So ambition came with a constant shadow of fear, and reputation was shaped by every small detail. How you spoke, how you dressed, how you treated superiors and inferiors, how you performed in ritual and ceremony. Even how you held your cup of tea could be judged. There was no escape from this scrutiny, and this judgment came from all sides. Your lord's court watched constantly. Fellow samurai looked for weakness, commoners whispered, and your own family added to the pressure, reminding you of your duty to uphold the clan's name. The result was a life lived on a stage, with no breaks, and rebuilding a damaged reputation was nearly impossible. If scandal touched you, it spread quickly, and apologies were rarely enough. Actions mattered more, and often the only action that could erase shame was death. So many samurai chose a tragic end not for personal reasons, but to protect their family's standing. And reputation was also political currency. Lords chose retainers based on it. Marriages were arranged through it. Opportunities opened or closed depending on it. And in a time of peace, when battlefield glory faded, reputation mattered even more. It became the battlefield of everyday life, and this led to endless competition. Samurai competed to display perfect loyalty, flawless manners, and exceptional refinement. But this competition bred envy and suspicion. Allies could become rivals overnight, and friendships were often shallow, maintained more for appearances than trust. And behind the scenes, slander was a constant threat. A well-placed rumor could ruin you. And because reputation mattered so much, people believed the worst quickly. Defending yourself was difficult. Once doubt was cast, it lingered, and the burden of proof lay on you, not the accuser. And women in samurai families faced the same pressures. A wife's conduct reflected on her husband. A daughter's behavior shaped marriage prospects. and the failure of a family member could drag down the entire household. So the whole family lived under the same suffocating expectations. And as the world changed, these pressures grew. In the Tokugawa period, with fewer wars and more rigid social order, the focus on reputation intensified. There were fewer chances to prove yourself in battle, so every small social detail mattered more. The margin for error shrank, and the contradictions multiplied. You were expected to be both a warrior and a scholar, a killer and a poet. You had to be bold in war and humble in peace. And balancing these demands was exhausting. Many samurai lived in constant fear of falling short in one area and ruining their standing. And for lower-ranking samurai, the burden was even greater. They lacked the resources to maintain appearances easily. Debt and poverty lurked close, yet they were judged by the same high standards, and failure was less forgiven. So they lived under crushing pressure, with fewer means to meet it. And all of this made true happiness rare. Samurai spoke often of duty, honor, and loyalty, but few spoke of joy. Life was a series of roles to be played, masks to be worn. And behind those masks, many carried deep loneliness and fear. But to show it would be unthinkable. And so the cycle continued. Reputation demanded perfection. Perfection was impossible. Fear of failure drove endless caution. And even small slips could destroy a life built on years of sacrifice. It was a system designed to consume those within it. And it did, over and over again. Now, let us turn to the myth of choice. Because one of the hardest truths about being a samurai was this: you had very little control over your own life. It was a life of duty, not freedom. And the higher your status, the more trapped you often became. Most samurai were born into their role. From childhood, they were taught that their path was fixed. You would serve your lord. You would uphold your family's honor. You would marry as arranged, and you would die as required. Personal dreams or ambitions were secondary, if considered at all. And this lack of choice began early. Your education was designed to mold you, not to explore your talents. You learned what you were told, practiced what was expected, and followed the path laid out for you. To stray from it was dangerous. To question it was almost unthinkable. And marriage was rarely a matter of love. Alliances between families mattered more. Marriages were arranged to strengthen bonds or secure favors. And once married, your role was fixed. You were expected to produce heirs and maintain the household's honor. Personal happiness was not part of the bargain. And even in matters of daily life, choice was limited. What you wore, what you ate, how you spoke, all were governed by rules of class and etiquette. You could not simply choose to live differently. The expectations of your role followed you everywhere, and your lord controlled much of your fate. You could be reassigned, punished, or rewarded on a whim. You could be ordered to fight, to govern, or to die. And refusing was rarely an option. Loyalty was absolute. Personal wishes did not enter the equation, and travel was restricted. Samurai could not simply move about as they pleased. Permissions were required, and in many cases, your entire life was bound to one domain. The wider world remained distant. a thing glimpsed in stories, but rarely experienced firsthand. And even in times of peace, this cage remained. With fewer wars, samurai spent more time in administrative roles, but these positions were often tedious and left little room for personal growth. You were expected to perform your duties with perfect diligence, but they brought little fulfillment, and many samurai turned to the arts. Poetry, calligraphy, tea ceremony, not out of pure love, but because these pursuits were one of the few socially acceptable outlets for personal expression. Yet even here, rules governed what was proper, and creativity was always balanced against expectation. And for those who chafed against the system, escape was almost impossible. To abandon your role was to abandon your family's honor. To flee meant becoming a ronin, a life of poverty and danger. And even this choice carried great shame. Most endured the life they were given, whether they wished to or not. And some did rebel, in small ways, quiet acts of resistance, private friendships, hidden interests, secret doubts. But these had to be concealed carefully. Discovery could bring ruin. So most samurai lived divided lives, outwardly perfect, inwardly questioning, and this lack of choice wore people down. The weight of constant duty, endless expectation, and little personal freedom led many to despair. But few could speak of it. To admit unhappiness was weakness, and weakness was shame, so the silence deepened. And the higher one rose, the worse it became. High-ranking samurai had more prestige, but less freedom. Their actions were watched more closely. Their families bore greater scrutiny, and their options, already narrow, became tighter still. And this system persisted because it served those in power. Lords valued obedience over initiative, stability over innovation, and samurai were taught to value the same. The result was a culture where personal choice was sacrificed to the needs of the hierarchy. And over time, this stifling life left its mark. Generations of samurai carried the burden of unfulfilled lives. They spoke of honor and duty because little else remained. And beneath the polished surface of Bushido lay countless stories of quiet sorrow and lost dreams. Now let us look at the myth of respect, because many imagine that samurai were universally admired by the people, that they were seen as noble protectors, paragons of virtue and strength. But the truth was often very different, and the gap between myth and reality made life even harder. Samurai stood at the top of the social hierarchy. Below them were peasants, artisans, and merchants, and this status brought certain privileges. But it also created resentment, because many commoners saw through the polished image of the samurai and understood the reality beneath it. Samurai collected taxes, enforced laws, punished dissent. And while some did so with fairness, others abused their power. Corruption was not rare. Neither was arrogance. Many samurai viewed commoners with disdain and treated them harshly, and the people remembered. And this resentment could not be voiced openly. To criticize a samurai was dangerous. Even minor slights could be punished severely. But behind polite words and deep bows, anger simmered. Peasants feared samurai, but they also hated them, and artisans and merchants, though officially lower in status, often viewed samurai as foolish or outdated, and this gap only widened as peace continued. With fewer wars, many samurai struggled to find purpose. They became more focused on maintaining appearances and asserting their status. And commoners, who worked hard to build wealth and stability, grew more frustrated with these idle warriors. Merchants in particular gained power. They controlled money, goods, and trade. And while samurai looked down on them, they often depended on them financially. This created a bitter irony. Samurai enforced their superiority while secretly relying on those they considered beneath them, and this tension showed in everyday life. Samurai demanded respect, but it was often given out of fear, not admiration. Peasants performed rituals of deference, but their hearts were far from loyal, and merchants smiled politely while calculating how to use the samurai's debts to their advantage. And for samurai who cared about honor, this false respect was deeply painful. They knew when it was hollow, and many struggled with the knowledge that they were no longer truly needed or admired. The world had changed, but their code had not. And the result was a life of increasing isolation. And the worst moments came during times of hardship, famine, disaster, or political turmoil brought the anger of the people closer to the surface. Samurai were the visible face of authority, and when the system failed, they became the target of blame. Riots, assassinations, and uprisings reminded them that their status was no shield, and even among themselves, respect was fragile. The strict hierarchy meant that lower-ranking samurai were often treated poorly by their superiors, and envy and rivalry poisoned many relationships. The polished image of a united warrior class was largely an illusion. Behind closed doors, politics and ambition ruled, and this poisoned respect extended to family life as well. Sons were taught to revere their fathers, but many saw the cracks in the system. Wives were expected to honor their husbands, but they witnessed the burdens and hypocrisies firsthand. And younger samurai, raised in a time of peace, often questioned the value of a code that seemed increasingly out of touch. And yet, the need to maintain the illusion persisted. Samurai could not speak openly of these doubts. They could not show frustration with the system. To do so would invite ruin. So they performed the rituals of respect, even as they doubted their meaning. And this deepened the loneliness of the samurai life. You could not trust the respect of others. You could not express your doubts. You lived surrounded by masks, wearing your own. And beneath it all, many samurai carried a growing sense of emptiness and regret. And as the world continued to change, the gap between myth and reality grew wider still. Samurai clung to their code, but fewer believed in it fully, and the respect they demanded became more hollow with each passing generation. Now let us talk about fear, because beneath all the rituals, all the pride, and all the carefully maintained appearances, fear shaped much of a samurai's life. It was a constant companion, and understanding this fear reveals much about why their lives were so difficult. Fear began with the sword. You wore it every day, not just as a weapon, but as a symbol. And this meant that violence was always near. A simple argument could escalate to a deadly duel. An insult, even unintentional, could force you to draw your blade and to hesitate was to invite disgrace, and fear extended to your lord. His favor meant life and status. His displeasure could mean ruin or death, and his moods were not always predictable. Political shifts, court intrigues, or personal whims could change your standing overnight. You might wake one morning secure and face forced a tragic end by nightfall. And fear was present in your own household. A single scandal could destroy your family. A careless word from a child. A moment of weakness from a wife. A rumor spread by a jealous rival. All could lead to shame and punishment. And as head of the family, you bore responsibility for every action under your roof, and fear shaped every public interaction. Samurai society was a web of rank and ritual. One wrong gesture, one poorly chosen word, one missed bow. These could mark you as disrespectful, and the penalties ranged from social isolation to official censure, or worse. And behind all this was the deepest fear of all, disgrace, more than death. Samurai feared losing face. To live in shame was considered worse than not living at all, and this fear drove many to end their lives, rather than face dishonor. It was not courage alone that led to a tragic end. Often, it was fear of what would follow if they did not. And fear extended to the future. Samurai were bound to the past, but uncertain of what lay ahead. The world was changing. Merchants grew in power. The economy shifted. New ideas spread, and many samurai feared that their way of life was becoming obsolete. But they could not say this openly. They could only watch in silence. And younger samurai felt this fear keenly, raised to honor a code that seemed increasingly disconnected from reality. They faced a choice with no good options. To abandon the code meant shame. To follow it meant irrelevance. And the fear of choosing wrongly haunted them, and this fear was compounded by isolation. Samurai were expected to be stoic, to endure without complaint. To speak of fear was weakness, so they suffered in silence, and many carried deep anxiety, knowing that their lives were built on a fragile foundation that could collapse at any moment. And fear also bred cruelty. Samurai who felt powerless sometimes lashed out at those below them. Peasants, artisans, and even family members bore the brunt of this misplaced anger. And this, in turn, deepened the cycle of resentment and isolation. And no amount of training could erase this fear. You could master swordsmanship, perfect your manners, and serve loyally. But the system remained unforgiving, and no one was immune. The higher you rose, the greater the fall, and the fear of falling never left you, and this constant fear left deep marks. Many samurai lived with suppressed emotions, unresolved grief, and quiet despair. But they had no language to express this, no space to seek relief. The code demanded strength, not honesty, and so they endured, at great personal cost. And in the end, this was perhaps the greatest tragedy. A life devoted to honor became a life consumed by fear, and beneath the polished image of the samurai was a human being, struggling to survive in a world that allowed little room for true peace or happiness. Now let us consider the matter of loyalty, because while Bushido held loyalty as a supreme virtue, In reality, this loyalty was often exploited, and the burden it placed on the samurai was not just heavy, it was dangerous. Loyalty was absolute, but it was rarely mutual. From the earliest years of training, a samurai was taught to serve his lord without question. This meant obeying orders, protecting territory, and, when necessary, dying in his master's name. It was the foundation of the samurai's world, but it left little space for thought or choice. And this blind loyalty was often abused. Lords used it to remove threats. If a retainer became too powerful or inconvenient, his unwavering loyalty could be used against him. One order, and he would be expected to face a tragic end without protest. It was the harshest form of obedience, and this dynamic repeated itself throughout samurai history. Talented warriors rose through the ranks, only to be discarded when they became politically risky. Their loyalty, once praised, was suddenly seen as a liability, and in most cases, they obeyed their final orders without hesitation, and even on a smaller scale, loyalty was weaponized. A samurai might be asked to support a policy he disagreed with, punish someone he cared for, or take a stance that endangered his family, all in the name of duty. Refusing was not an option. The consequences were swift and severe, and loyalty did not guarantee protection. If a lord was overthrown, his loyal retainers were often punished alongside him. Lands were confiscated, families scattered, death sentences issued, and no distinction was made between the guilty and the obedient. Loyalty, in such cases, became a curse, and even when a samurai served faithfully for decades, the reward might be nothing more than continued obligation. Promotions were rare, favor was fleeting, and the ever-present fear of dismissal or disgrace remained. In many cases, the most loyal were the first to be sacrificed, and yet the pressure to remain loyal was immense. It was not just personal, it was cultural, social, and spiritual. To betray a lord, even an unjust one, was unthinkable. The shame would follow not just the samurai, but his entire lineage. It could poison a family's name for generations, and this created impossible situations. A samurai might know that his lord was corrupt or incompetent. He might believe the orders were unjust, but he could do nothing. To disobey was treason. To speak out was rebellion, and so silence and obedience remained the only path. And some lords understood this power and wielded it ruthlessly. They surrounded themselves with loyal retainers and demanded ever greater sacrifices. And because the samurai code forbade questioning, these lords operated without limits. Their warriors served not from respect, but from fear and tradition. And this reality clashed with the ideals taught to every young samurai. They were told their lords would protect and guide them. That mutual respect would bind them. But the truth was harsher. Power did not always come with virtue, and many samurai learned this too late. And loyalty also created divisions. Samurai were expected to prioritize their lord over all else, even family. A father might be ordered to punish his own son. A brother might be sent to fight against a cousin. The code demanded such sacrifices, and those who refused were branded as cowards or traitors. And over time, this blind loyalty hollowed out many lives. It stripped away personal judgment. It crushed independent thought, and it left many samurai carrying out orders they knew were wrong, simply because the code allowed no other choice. And in peaceful times, this loyalty became even more rigid. With fewer wars to test real courage, lords turned to strict rules and demands. Samurai enforced loyalty through rituals, surveillance, and constant reminders of duty. And the result was a class that spoke of honor, but lived in quiet submission, and still, most endured. They served, obeyed, and remained loyal even as the world around them changed. Because the alternative, disgrace, exile, or dishonor, was too much to bear, and so loyalty became a prison, built not from chains, but from words and silence. Now let us consider the cost of this life on the samurai themselves. Because beneath the armor and the code, they were human, and the pressures they faced left deep scars, physical, emotional, and mental. It was a life of endurance, not fulfillment. Start with the body. Samurai training was harsh from an early age. Endless drills, heavy armor, long hours of riding, archery, and swordsmanship. Injuries were common, bones broken, muscles torn, and even after healing, pain often remained. Yet to show it was weakness. So they endured in silence, and the armor they wore, while protective, took a toll. Hours spent in layers of iron and leather under the sun left many with permanent damage. Compressed spines, chronic joint pain, and fatigue that no rest could fully erase. Yet every day they donned it again, because duty required it. And in battle, wounds were a constant risk. Arrows, blades, spears, each could end a life or leave lasting damage. And battlefield medicine was crude. Many survived only to face infections, amputations, and long, painful recoveries. Scars were worn with pride, though the hardships were many. And these physical burdens were matched by emotional ones, the fear, the isolation, the constant need for perfection, all weighed heavily. Anxiety, depression, and despair were common, though they had no names for these struggles. To speak of them would invite shame, so they remained hidden, and the toll of repeated trauma cannot be overstated. Many samurai witnessed horrors, friends cut down, villages burned, innocents punished. They carried these memories with them, unable to share or process them. Nightmares, guilt, and a constant sense of unease followed many to their graves. And the pressure to maintain composure at all times only worsened this. A samurai could not cry openly, could not admit fear, could not ask for help. They were trapped behind a mask of stoicism, even as the weight inside grew heavier with each passing year. And the expectations placed on their families added another layer of stress. A samurai's failure did not just affect him. His disgrace could doom his wife, children, and extended relatives. And knowing this added a constant, gnawing fear. Every action carried the risk of harming those you loved most. And even success brought little relief. Promotions meant more scrutiny. Higher status meant fewer trusted friends. And the political games of the court could be as deadly as any battlefield. Many samurai rose only to fall, brought down by envy, intrigue, or a single misstep, and personal relationships suffered. Friendship was risky. Trust was fragile. Marriage was bound by duty more than affection. Many samurai led lonely lives, unable to confide in others, unable to express their true feelings, and this isolation deepened the internal wounds they carried. And as peace endured, the disconnect between their training and their daily lives grew sharper. They were warriors without wars, bound to a code that felt increasingly hollow, and this dissonance left many adrift, questioning their purpose, but unable to voice their doubts. And some turned to the arts for solace: poetry, calligraphy, tea ceremony. These became quiet refuges. But even here, perfection was demanded. The pursuit of beauty offered moments of peace, but also new pressures to excel. And true rest remained elusive, and others turned to darker escapes: gambling, drinking, violence. These were not condoned, but they happened, and those who fell too far faced ruin. Yet for some, these vices were the only relief from a life that offered little joy and demanded endless sacrifice. And in the end, many samurai died not in battle, but in quiet despair, broken by the system they served, forgotten by the lords they had obeyed, their names erased, their sacrifices unremembered. And beneath the proud tales of Bushido lay countless stories of unseen suffering. Now, let us look at the pressures faced by samurai women, because the struggles of the samurai life were not limited to the battlefield or the training hall. They extended deeply into the home, and for women, the burdens were immense, though often overlooked in stories of the era. A samurai wife was expected to embody loyalty, obedience, and grace. Her marriage was arranged, often for political reasons, not love. From the day she entered her husband's household, her role was fixed. She managed the home, raised the children, and upheld the family's honor. And this was no small task. The household reflected on the samurai's standing. A well-run home brought respect. A poorly run one invited gossip and shame. And every action, from how meals were prepared to how guests were received, was judged by strict standards. And the wife carried heavy emotional burdens. She lived with the constant knowledge that her husband could be ordered to war, to political service, or to ritual death. And if disgrace touched the family, she and her children could suffer alongside him, or be ordered to follow him in death, and loyalty was demanded without question. If her husband was ordered to commit a tragic end, she was expected to support him calmly. If the family faced ruin, she was to bear it with dignity, and in some cases, she might be expected to follow the tradition of an honorable end herself to preserve the family's honor. And beyond this, she was also responsible for raising the next generation. Sons were trained early in the ways of Bushido. Daughters were prepared to manage their own future households, and the mother's role in this was critical. Any failure in the children reflected back on her, and personal desires were of little importance. A samurai wife was expected to suppress her own wishes and ambitions. Her life was defined by duty to her husband, her children, and her family's reputation. And any sign of discontent was seen as weakness or selfishness, and relationships were often strained. Love might grow over time, but it was not the foundation of the marriage, and the pressures of samurai life left little space for affection. Husbands, consumed by duty and fear, often remained emotionally distant, and wives had few outlets for their own feelings, and isolation was common. Samurai women could not easily form friendships outside their class, and within their circles, relationships were shaped by competition and hierarchy. Trust was hard to build, and many lived surrounded by others, yet deeply alone. And in times of political turmoil, their position was even more precarious. If a husband fell from favor, the wife's status vanished with his. She could be cast out, forced into poverty, or worse, and her children's futures would be similarly destroyed. And even in times of peace, the constant pressure remained. The household was a stage, always on display, and perfection was demanded in every detail. The strain of maintaining this facade, day after day, left many women exhausted and unfulfilled, and escape was nearly impossible. Divorce was rare, and carried great stigma. Returning to one's family brought shame, and independent life for a woman of the samurai class was not an option. The path was narrow and unyielding, and most had no choice but to walk it, and their suffering was rarely acknowledged. The tales of samurai valor focused on men. Women's sacrifices remained in the background, unspoken, yet they bore their own wounds of fear, of loss, of dreams abandoned, and these wounds were no less real than those of the battlefield. And some found quiet strength within these confines. They mastered the arts, preserved family traditions, and supported their children's future. But even this strength came at a cost, and the weight of unspoken sorrow remained, carried with grace because there was no other choice. And so, in the shadows of the samurai world, the women endured, bound by the same code, trapped by the same expectations. They lived lives of sacrifice and silence, and their untold stories are as much a part of the samurai legacy as any tale of sword or battle. Now let us consider the life of a samurai child, because from the earliest age, their path was marked by duty and expectation. And while stories often focus on adult warriors, the seeds of this difficult life were planted in childhood, and they left lasting marks. A samurai child was born into a world of rigid rules. From infancy, they were taught that they were different from commoners, that their blood carried honor, and that this honor had to be protected at all costs. It was a heavy burden for young shoulders, and their education reflected this. Boys were trained not just in academics, but in the way of the warrior. Swordsmanship, archery, riding, all began early. They were taught the principles of Bushido alongside reading and writing, and failure in any area was unacceptable, and discipline was harsh. Mistakes were met with stern correction. Tears were discouraged. A samurai child was expected to show composure even in training. To fall behind was to bring shame to the family, and so the pressure to excel was constant, and this left little room for play. While other children might enjoy carefree moments, samurai boys were often in the dojo or on the training grounds. Their days were scheduled, their futures predetermined, and any sign of rebellion was quickly corrected, and the expectations for girls were equally demanding. They were taught household management, etiquette, and the arts. They were prepared to uphold the family's honor through marriage and service, and while they might learn self-defense, their primary role was always tied to the home. And like their brothers, they faced constant judgment. Their behavior reflected on the family. Grace, obedience, and diligence were demanded, and from an early age, they learned to suppress personal desires for the sake of duty. And family relationships were shaped by this system. Fathers were often distant, consumed by their own obligations. Mothers, under immense pressure themselves, could be strict and exacting. Affection was present, but it was often overshadowed by the demands of honor, and friendships were difficult. Samurai children were taught to view others through the lens of rank and duty. Genuine bonds could be risky, as political shifts might turn friends into rivals. And trust was hard to build in a world where appearances mattered so much, and the shadow of death loomed even in youth. Children knew that their fathers could be called to battle, or expected to meet a tragic end at any time, and they were taught that they too must be ready to sacrifice if required. It was a harsh lesson to learn so young, and for boys, the pressure to succeed was relentless. They carried the hopes of the family. Their progress in training was closely watched, and a single failure could damage not just their own future, but their family's standing. The fear of letting others down was ever present. And for girls, marriage prospects were a constant concern. Their behavior and accomplishments were scrutinized with an eye toward future alliances, and the pressure to embody perfection in all things left many carrying quiet anxieties they could never voice, and the emotional cost of this upbringing was high. Many samurai children grew up with a deep sense of isolation and fear. They learned early to mask their feelings, to endure without complaint, and this emotional suppression followed them into adulthood. And while some found pride in their role, others struggled. But few had a choice. The path was set, and even those who wished for a different life knew that to pursue it would bring shame and suffering to their families. And so, the cycle continued. Each new generation raised to uphold a system that allowed little room for joy or freedom, and beneath the stories of honor and valor lay countless childhoods marked by sacrifice, loneliness, and the quiet weight of impossible expectations. Now let us explore what happened when a samurai became a ronin, because if the life of a samurai was difficult, the life of a ronin was often worse. It was a fall from honor, a slide into uncertainty, and for many, the beginning of true hardship. And it revealed just how fragile a samurai's position could be. A ronin was a samurai without a master. This could happen for many reasons. Perhaps the lord was killed. Perhaps he lost his lands. Perhaps the samurai had been dismissed or had chosen to leave. Whatever the cause, the result was the same: disgrace, suspicion, and a loss of status. And the fall was swift. One day, you were part of the warrior class. The next, you were cast out. You could no longer wear your swords in the same way. You could no longer speak with the same authority. People who once bowed to you now avoided your eyes. You became a shadow, and support vanished quickly. Without a lord, you had no income, no patronage, and no protection. Some Ronin tried to find new employment, but opportunities were few. Most lords distrusted Ronin. They were seen as unpredictable, desperate, and dangerous, and many refused to take them in. And life on the road was unforgiving. Ronin wandered from town to town, seeking work or shelter. Some tried to survive as teachers, bodyguards, or scribes. Others begged, and many turned to crime, not because they wanted to, but because hunger left them no choice, and the law treated them harshly. Authorities saw Ronin as a threat to order. They were watched closely, accused easily, punished quickly. A Ronin who drew his sword could face death, regardless of the cause, and few would speak in his defense, and loneliness became a constant companion. Former comrades shunned you. Family ties weakened. Even other Ronin were wary of each other. You could not trust easily. You could not rest easily. Every day was uncertain, and every night brought the fear that tomorrow would be worse. And those with pride suffered the most. Trained for honor, they now lived in disgrace. They carried their swords, but they meant little. The code they once followed had no place for them, and many Ronin found themselves questioning everything they had once believed in. And some tried to prove their worth through acts of valor. Stories tell of Ronin who performed great deeds to regain honor. But these were rare exceptions. For most, the struggle to survive left no time for glory. It was a quiet, grinding erosion of self. And families of Ronin suffered as well. Wives and children bore the same stigma. Marriage prospects vanished. Social standing collapsed. They were pitied at best, scorned at worst. And often, they too were forced into poverty. And for those who once held high rank, the humiliation was even greater. They had known the taste of respect. Now they faced closed doors and averted eyes, and the bitterness of that contrast wore them down day by day. And not all Ronin fell into ruin. Some adapted. They built new lives through trade, teaching, or art. But even those who found stability rarely escaped the shadow of their fall. The past followed them, and society never fully let them forget what they had lost. And the system offered little path back. Few were reinstated. Fewer still regained their former status. The world of the samurai had no room for those who had stepped outside it. And the code that had once bound them offered no guidance for this new reality. And so many Ronin lived in a strange limbo. No longer samurai, but not fully commoners either, always marked by the past. Always struggling to find a place in a world that had moved on without them. Now let us turn to the matter of aging, because the life of a samurai was demanding at every stage. But growing old within that system brought its own special burdens. And while youth was consumed by training and service, old age was often marked by quiet struggles that few spoke of. Aging samurai faced physical decline, of course. Years of harsh training, heavy armor, and battle injuries took a toll. Joints stiffened, strength faded. Pain became a constant companion. Yet there was no space to show weakness. The image of the stoic warrior had to be maintained. And this created a difficult tension. You knew your body was failing, but to admit it was shameful. To step aside too soon could bring whispers of cowardice. To stay too long in active service could lead to disgrace through failure. It was a narrow path, with no perfect solution. And for those fortunate enough to retire formally, new challenges emerged. Life slowed, but the expectations did not. You were still watched, still judged. Your household had to remain proper. Your conduct had to remain flawless. And the slightest slip could tarnish a lifetime of service. And idleness was not an option. Retired samurai were expected to engage in scholarly or artistic pursuits, writing poetry, practicing calligraphy, teaching the young. These were noble tasks, but they brought their own pressures. To produce mediocre work was embarrassing, to show decline was dangerous, and financial concerns grew sharper with age. Stipends might be reduced, savings depleted, and samurai could not easily turn to trade or manual labor. Such work was seen as beneath them, yet pride alone did not put food on the table. And many aged samurai faced quiet poverty. And for those without strong family support, the risks were greater still. A samurai without loyal children or a stable household could find himself isolated. Old friendships faded. New ones were hard to form. And loneliness crept in, a slow erosion of the spirit. And fear remained. The fear of disgrace did not fade with age. In fact, it sharpened. An old samurai who failed in conduct or propriety could bring ruin upon his descendants. And so every word, every gesture had to be weighed carefully, even in supposed retirement. And memories haunted many. Scenes from past battles, friends lost, mistakes made. There was little space to process these experiences. The culture demanded stoicism, not reflection. And many carried unseen burdens that grew heavier with each passing year. And for some, the pressure became too great. Stories tell of elderly samurai who chose a tragic end rather than face the slow decline of body and status. It was seen as a final act of control, a way to preserve honor, but it also reflected the deep fear of becoming a burden or an object of pity. And women faced similar struggles in old age. A samurai widow or mother still carried the family's honor. She was expected to maintain dignity, oversee the household, and guide younger generations. But her voice often carried less weight, and her own needs were easily overlooked, and the passing of time brought another pain, the loss of the familiar world. Friends and comrades died. The customs of youth faded. New generations questioned old values, and many aged samurai felt adrift, caught between a code they had served and a society that was slowly moving beyond it. And so, old age, like every other stage of the samurai life, was shaped by duty, fear, and isolation. There was little space for rest, little freedom to simply be. The expectations followed you to the grave, and for many, the final years were as demanding and as lonely as any that had come before. Now let us consider the role of ceremony, because in the life of a samurai, ceremony was not just tradition. It was a tool of control, and it shaped every moment of daily existence, adding yet another layer of pressure to an already demanding life. Ceremony governed almost everything: how you greeted others, how you dressed, how you ate, how you moved within a room. Every action followed prescribed forms, and to deviate, even slightly, was to risk disgrace. And these ceremonies were not limited to grand occasions. They permeated the mundane. Serving tea was an art, with every gesture defined. Writing a letter required careful choice of words and symbols. Walking through a lord's hall demanded precise posture and pace, and this constant need for perfection left little space for spontaneity. You could not simply act on impulse. You could not express joy or sorrow freely. You lived behind a mask of ritual, performing roles that often felt hollow, but were vital to maintaining your standing. And mastery of ceremony was not optional. Samurai were judged as much on their conduct in these small matters as on their prowess in battle. A warrior who fought bravely but failed in etiquette could still bring shame upon himself and his family. And the learning never ended. As you advanced in rank or entered new circles, new forms of ceremony awaited. Each demanded study and practice, and the slightest lapse could undo years of careful effort. And this was especially true in the presence of superiors. A misplaced bow, a poorly timed phrase, an incorrect seating arrangement, any of these could offend. And the fear of such mistakes made every formal occasion an ordeal rather than a joy. And even in private, the habits of ceremony remained. A samurai could not fully relax. Servants observed. Family members followed example. And so the performance continued, day and night, leaving little space for true rest or honesty. And those who struggled with these demands faced real consequences. Stories tell of samurai whose careers ended over minor breaches of decorum. Others found themselves marginalized, their reputations quietly eroded by whispers of improper conduct. And the burden was heavier for those from less prestigious families. They often lacked the early training needed to master high-level ceremonies. And so they lived in constant fear of revealing their deficiencies, working twice as hard to meet expectations. And for women, the pressure was equally intense. Household ceremonies required flawless execution, managing guests, overseeing rituals, even arranging flowers, all demanded skill and precision. And failure reflected not just on the woman, but on her entire family. And as peace continued, the focus on ceremony only grew. With fewer battles to fight, samurai competed in the arena of culture and conduct. And mastery of ceremony became a key marker of status. But this shift brought new frustrations. Warriors trained for combat found themselves trapped in endless, stifling rituals. And some embraced this world, finding beauty and meaning in its forms. But many chafed under its demands. They longed for the freedom of action that battle once provided, and they struggled with the knowledge that their worth was now judged as much by the angle of a bow as by the sharpness of a blade. And this tension further deepened the sense of disconnection. The code of Bushido spoke of courage and loyalty, but daily life demanded careful, calculated performance. And beneath the surface, many samurai wrestled with the quiet despair of a life spent in constant, wearying display. Now let us look at the myth of freedom. Because while samurai are often portrayed as noble individuals who carved their own path, the reality was quite the opposite. The life of a samurai was one of rigid control, shaped by forces far beyond personal choice, and true freedom was an illusion. From birth, a samurai's path was set. Family, class, and duty defined every aspect of life. Personal desires were secondary, if acknowledged at all. You were trained to serve, not to dream, and even small acts of independence could bring swift consequences. And this began early. Education was not about fostering curiosity, but about instilling obedience. You learned what was required. You practiced what was demanded, and questioning this structure was dangerous. Conformity was the safest path. And as you grew older, the walls closed in further. Marriage was arranged. Career choices were limited. Your allegiance to your lord was absolute, and mobility within the system was rare. Few samurai rose far above their birth, and many found themselves trapped by circumstances beyond their control. And even wealth offered little escape. A prosperous samurai still lived under the same expectations. More money might ease material concerns, but it also brought greater scrutiny. The higher you climbed, the more rigid the demands became. And personal freedom remained elusive, and the strict social hierarchy reinforced this. Every interaction was governed by rank and role. You could not easily befriend those above or below you. You could not speak freely, and even private moments were shaped by the ever-present need to maintain proper conduct. And leaving the system was nearly impossible. To renounce your status meant disgrace. To become a ronin meant hardship, and few had the courage or the means to pursue such a path. Most remained where they were, bound by duty and fear. And for those who did seek a different life, the barriers were formidable. Samurai were forbidden from engaging in trade, manual labor was beneath their station, and other professions were closed to them. The world beyond the warrior class remained largely out of reach, and this lack of freedom bred quiet frustration. Many samurai longed for more, for the chance to shape their own lives, to pursue personal interests, to speak their minds. But the code of Bushido left little space for such desires, and so they remained hidden, suppressed beneath the surface, and creative expression, while valued, was not an outlet for true freedom. Even in poetry, calligraphy, or tea ceremony, strict rules governed form and content. Innovation was discouraged. The goal was to perfect established traditions, not to explore new ideas. And political life offered no greater liberty. Samurai serving in administrative roles were bound by the will of their lords. Dissent was dangerous, and loyalty was valued above wisdom. To speak against authority, even with good reason, was to invite ruin. And so, many lived with a deep sense of confinement. They fulfilled their duties, maintained appearances, and upheld the code. But beneath the surface, a longing for freedom persisted, a longing they could rarely express and never fully satisfy. And this tension shaped much of the internal struggle of the samurai. They were trained to value honor, loyalty, and discipline, but the human desire for autonomy remained, and reconciling these forces was a constant, often painful challenge. And over time, this quiet conflict wore many down. The cost of living a life without freedom was high. It eroded joy, stifled creativity, and left a deep sense of emptiness. And while the world saw the proud warrior, the inner reality was often one of quiet resignation. Now let us turn to the idea of legacy, because for the samurai, legacy was everything. It shaped their actions, guided their choices, and weighed heavily upon them. But this, too, added to the hardships of their lives, because maintaining a legacy was a burden few could fully bear. A samurai did not live for himself alone. He carried the honor of his ancestors. Every deed reflected not just on the present, but on the past, and every failure threatened to tarnish a lineage carefully built over generations. And this began in childhood. Boys were told the stories of their forebears, tales of bravery, loyalty, sacrifice. These stories set the standard. You were expected to match or surpass them. To fall short was shameful, and the pressure to live up to this ideal was immense. And this pressure only grew with time. Each success brought new expectations. Each promotion added new scrutiny, and each mistake threatened not just personal standing, but the reputation of the entire family. The fear of failure was constant, and death was not an escape from this burden. Even in dying, a samurai had to consider his legacy, how he faced death, what he left behind, the final words he spoke, the poem he wrote. All were judged, and a single misstep could undo a lifetime of service. And this obsession with legacy shaped every part of life. Marriages were arranged with an eye towards strengthening the family line. Children were raised to continue the tradition, and personal desires were often sacrificed to preserve or enhance the family's standing, and even small choices were influenced by this concern. What you wore, how you spoke, whom you associated with, all were carefully considered, because every detail contributed to the image you left for future generations, and the burden was heavier for prominent families. The greater the legacy, the greater the fear of tarnishing it, and many samurai from such families lived in constant anxiety, knowing that a single failure could bring generations of honor crashing down. And this created a cycle of caution and conformity. Few dared to challenge tradition. Few dared to pursue new paths. The safest course was to follow established forms, and this stifled innovation, deepened isolation, and reinforced the rigid structure of samurai life. And for those who did stumble, the consequences were severe. A samurai who failed might see his name struck from family records, his deeds erased, his descendants shunned, and the shame extended far beyond the individual, affecting the entire family line. And this fear extended even to the afterlife. Samurai believed that their spirits would be judged not just by their own actions, but by the state of their family. A tarnished legacy could haunt them beyond death, and this belief added yet another layer of pressure to an already demanding existence. And women shared this burden. A wife's conduct reflected on her husband. A daughter's marriage impacted the family's alliances, and mothers bore the responsibility of instilling the values of Bushido in their children. Their role in shaping the family legacy was vital, though often unacknowledged. And in times of change, this focus on legacy became even more difficult to maintain. As the old ways eroded, many samurai struggled to preserve their family's place, and the fear of becoming irrelevant, of seeing a proud name fade, weighed heavily on them. And so, the pursuit of legacy, meant to inspire greatness, often became a source of deep anxiety and sorrow. It bound the samurai to a life of endless caution, constant pressure, and few true moments of peace. And beneath the polished image of honor, many lived with the quiet fear that their best efforts might still not be enough. Now let us reflect on the slow decline of the samurai, because in the end, all things change. And as Japan entered new eras, the life that once defined the warrior class began to fade. But this fading was not easy. It brought new hardships and left many samurai struggling to find their place in a world that no longer needed them. The long peace of the Tokugawa shogunate, though welcomed by many, gradually undermined the warrior ideal. With fewer wars to fight, the samurai's role became more ceremonial. They served as administrators, guards, and symbols of a past age. But the skills they had trained for were no longer in demand, and as economic and social shifts accelerated, the tension grew. Merchants gained wealth and influence. Peasants became more self-reliant, and the strict social hierarchy began to show cracks. The samurai, once revered, now often appeared as relics clinging to outdated values, and financial struggles deepened the crisis. Stipends remained fixed, while the cost of living rose. Many samurai fell into debt. They could not easily enter trade without losing face, and so they borrowed from the very merchants they looked down upon, deepening their dependence and resentment. And as new ideas entered Japan, ideas of individual rights, commerce, and change, many younger samurai questioned their path. They saw that loyalty and ceremony no longer secured prosperity or respect, but breaking free from the old ways remained dangerous and difficult. And political reforms eventually forced the issue. With the Meiji Restoration, the samurai class was officially abolished. Stipends were ended, sword-wearing was restricted, and many former samurai faced an uncertain future with little preparation for the new world. Some adapted, becoming teachers, officials, or businessmen. Others struggled, lost without the structure that had once defined their lives, and for many, the sense of betrayal was deep. They had given everything to a system that had cast them aside when it no longer needed them, and the loss of identity was profound. A samurai without a code, without status, without clear duty. This was not just a social change, it was a personal crisis. Many faced it with quiet dignity, others with anger, and some with despair. And yet, even in decline, the ideals of Bushido left their mark. The values of discipline, loyalty, and honor continued to influence Japanese culture. But they were now remembered as echoes of a time when life was bound by duty and shaped by fear. And so the story of the samurai is not just one of swords and glory. It is a story of sacrifice, isolation, and silent suffering. It is a story of human beings trapped by a system that demanded perfection and offered little room for happiness. And now, as we reach the end of this quiet journey, remember that beneath the shining armor and graceful bows were real lives, lives shaped by endless duty, silent fear, and the unrelenting pursuit of honor. The way of the samurai was as tragic as it was noble. And as you drift off to sleep tonight, take a moment to reflect on their story. And when you wake up, subscribe to the channel Sleepy History.